There are events in the history of commercial aviation that never quite get a clean ending. The aircraft lands, the passengers go home, and the file gets closed. But if you go back and actually read what the crew said in the hours afterward, before the official explanation arrived to smooth everything over, you start to notice something. The same kind of account keeps surfacing. Trained pilots, people who fly for a living, and who know exactly what an aircraft, a planet, and a weather formation look like from a cockpit, describing something that did not fit any of those categories. And what makes it harder to dismiss is that this is not one strange night told by one strange person. It is the same shape of story, reported decades apart, by crews who had no way of knowing the others existed. Normally, when something unusual happens in the air, it gets logged. There is a timestamp, a controller's tape, a radar return, a flight number. That is the entire point of the system. But in certain cases, the record the crew gives and the record the institution settles on do not line up. The explanation is filed, the question is closed, and the people who were actually there are left describing something the paperwork does not contain. In this video, we are going to look at 5 encounters reported by commercial flight crews in cases that were investigated by official bodies and that, depending on who you ask, were never fully resolved. Case 1. The Eastern Airlines DC-3 over Alabama. In the early hours of July 24, 1948, an Eastern Airlines Douglas DC-3 was making the run from Houston toward Atlanta, cruising at roughly 5,000 feet through clear skies near Montgomery, Alabama. In the cockpit were Captain Clarence Chiles and First Officer John Whitted, both seasoned aviators with thousands of hours and wartime military flying behind them. At about 2:45 in the morning, Chiles noticed a glow ahead and slightly to the right. His first thought was that it was another aircraft, a military jet perhaps, closing fast. Within seconds, it became obvious that whatever it was not a jet. The two men described an object shaped like a cigar or a torpedo, roughly 100 feet long, with no visible wings or tail. Along its side, they reported what looked like 2 rows of windows or openings, glowing with an intense light they later compared to burning magnesium. A jet of flame trailed behind it. Chiles banked the DC-3 hard to the left, and the object passed on the right, before pulling up sharply into the cloud layer and vanishing. The whole encounter lasted perhaps 10 to 15 seconds. A passenger who happened to be awake glimpsed only a bright streak through his window. What makes this case difficult to set aside is that the 2 pilots were not the only observers that night. About an hour before the encounter, a ground crew chief stationed at Robbins Air Force Base near Macon, Georgia, reported watching an extremely bright object streak overhead at high speed. When investigators later plotted the path the pilots described, it lined up with the direction of that earlier sighting. The Air Force studied the case and concluded that no known aircraft or missile in the area could account for what the crew had seen. For a time, internal analysts treated it as one of the cases that convinced them the phenomenon was real. Years later, the official position shifted, and the encounter was reclassified as a bright meteor. The pilots, for the rest of their careers, maintained that a meteor does not have rows of lit windows and does not pull up to avoid an aircraft. Their account was taken seriously enough at the time to land on the front page of an Atlanta newspaper the very next day, and both men sat down within days to sketch what they had seen. The 2 drawings, made separately, matched. Case 2. Japan Airlines, 1628, over the Arctic. On the evening of November 17, 1986, a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 cargo freighter, call sign 1628, was flying the long northern route from Paris toward Tokyo, carrying a load of Beaujolais wine. The routing took it through Reykjavik in Iceland, then on toward a planned stop at Anchorage, and it was on this leg, out of Iceland, and across the Alaskan interior in darkness, that the encounter unfolded. In command was Captain Kenju Terauchi, a former fighter pilot with close to 3 decades in the air and more than 10,000 flight hours. Terauchi noticed 2 clusters of lights pacing his aircraft. At first he assumed they were military traffic. Then the lights moved in ways no conventional aircraft should, holding station off his wing, shifting position together, and at one point appearing to fill the windscreen with a glow he said he could feel as warmth on his face. The 2 smaller objects eventually fell away and were replaced, in his account, by something far larger. He described an enormous structure silhouetted against the night sky, which he estimated dwarfed his own jumbo jet. Terauchi radioed Anchorage Air Traffic Control to report the unidentified traffic. Controllers monitored Flight 1628 closely, queried a nearby Air Force radar facility, and even routed a passing United Airlines flight to take a look. At one point, ground control raised the possibility of scrambling a military aircraft to intercept the object. Terauchi declined. He was reportedly thinking of an earlier piece of aviation history, the 1948 death of a fighter pilot who had chased a UFO and crashed, and he did not want an armed jet closing on whatever was out there with his freighter in the middle of it. The object stayed with the 747 for roughly half an hour before disappearing as the aircraft approached Anchorage, where it landed without incident. The aftermath is where this case earns its reputation. The crew was interviewed by federal officials within hours. John Callahan, who was then the division chief in charge of accidents and investigations at the FAA, would later go public, stating that the agency had radar data and crew testimony it never adequately explained, and that the material drew attention from multiple government offices. The skeptical conclusion that eventually emerged was that Terauchi had mistaken the planets Jupiter and Mars, and the file noted he had reported other sightings before. But that explanation has its own problem. Planets do not pace a moving aircraft for 30 minutes, do not appear and then vanish on command, and do not prompt experienced controllers to ask a military radar station to confirm a target. Decades later, the full set of investigation documents was finally pried loose through public records requests, and researchers are still arguing over what they actually show. One detail tends to get lost in that argument. After Terauchi spoke to the press about what he had seen, his own airline pulled him off flying duty and moved him to a desk job, a response that says less about meteors than it does about how unwelcome this kind of report is, even when it comes from one of your most experienced captains. Case 3. America West 564 over the Texas Panhandle. Late on the night of May 25, 1995, an America West Boeing 757, call sign Cactus 564, was on the final leg of a run that had started in Tampa, heading west toward Las Vegas at around 39,000 feet. Near the small town of Bovina in the Texas Panhandle, just east of the New Mexico line, a thunderstorm system was flickering on the northern horizon. The lead flight attendant, watching the lightning, was the first to notice something that did not belong. A horizontal row of intensely bright lights, roughly 8 of them, flashing in sequence from one end to the other, white with a faint bluish cast and as bright as landing lights. First Officer John Waller saw them next, and Captain Eugene Tollefson left his seat to look as well. The lights appeared to be below the aircraft and somewhat to the side. Then, as a burst of lightning lit the clouds behind the lights, the crew got a glimpse of what the lights were attached to. Backlit against the storm was a dark, solid shape they described as cigar-like and enormous, with estimates running from 300 to 500 feet in length. The crew reported the object to Albuquerque Air Traffic Control and watched it for several minutes as their aircraft pulled ahead of it. Albuquerque could find nothing on its own radar, so a controller reached out to military air defense. The responses that came back are the strangest part of the record. Initially, the crew was told a target had been tracked, then that it was likely a small aircraft flying with a dead transponder. The following day, by some accounts, the controller was told the facility had in fact tracked an unidentified return the night before, one that had sat motionless and then accelerated and stopped again with a rapidity no conventional aircraft could manage. An independent investigator later obtained the air traffic control voice tapes through records requests, interviewed the crew and controllers, filed his own Freedom of Information requests, and checked whether any military activity that night could account for the sighting. He found nothing that fit, and the case is still cited as one of the best documented commercial pilot encounters on record. Skeptics have argued the lights were distant stars or planets glimpsed through broken cloud. The crew's answer was simple. Stars do not get silhouetted by the lightning in front of them. Case 4. The disk over O'Hare. This one did not happen at altitude. It happened on the ground, at one of the busiest airports on the planet in broad daylight. On the afternoon of November 7, 2006, a ramp worker at Chicago O'Hare was guiding the pushback of United Airlines, Flight 446, a departure bound for Charlotte, when he looked up and saw something hovering over the gate area. He alerted the flight's cockpit crew by radio, and within minutes, word had spread across the ground frequency. By the time it was over, roughly a dozen United employees, pilots, mechanics, gate staff, and managers reported watching the same thing. A dark, gray, metallic, disc-shaped object holding completely still beneath a low overcast, directly above gate C17. The witnesses agreed it was silent and motionless, an object simply parked in the air where nothing should have been parked. Estimates of its size varied, as they tend to with an object at uncertain distance, but the descriptions of its behavior were consistent. After hovering for several minutes, it shot straight up at high speed and punched a clean, roughly circular hole through the cloud layer, a gap that several people said remained visible for a short time afterward, as though the object had cut its way out. A number of people outside the airport reported seeing it as well. No air traffic controller saw the object, and it left no radar return. When a Chicago newspaper later filed a records request, the FLI at first said it had nothing on file. Then a record surfaced of a phone call from a United supervisor to the control tower on the day in question, reporting exactly the object the agency had said it knew nothing about. The official conclusion, once one was offered, was that the sighting was a weather phenomenon, and no formal investigation was opened. The witnesses, who handle aircraft for a living and spend their working lives looking at that exact patch of sky, were not persuaded that a weather event hovers silently over a single gate and then drills a hole in the clouds on its way out. Case 5. The lights off the coast of Ireland. Just before 7 o'clock on the morning of November 9, 2018, the pilot of a British Airways Boeing 787, flying from Montreal toward London and using the call sign Speedbird 94, contacted Shannon Air Traffic Control off the southwest coast of Ireland. She had a straightforward question that controllers do not hear often. She asked whether there were any military exercises underway in the area, because something extremely bright had come up alongside her aircraft on the left, then veered sharply to the north and disappeared at very high speed. Shannon checked and told her there was no military activity, and nothing was showing on either primary or secondary radar. What lifts this case above a single odd report is that she was not alone. Within the same window, the crew of a Virgin aircraft transiting the same airspace came on the frequency describing the same thing from their own vantage point. They reported multiple bright lights following a similar track, climbing away at what one of them put at roughly twice the speed of sound. Another pilot in the area chimed in as well, relieved to hear he had not been the only one to see it. 3 separate flight crews, on the same morning, independently describing fast-moving bright objects that left no trace on radar. Because these were professional crews talking to a national air traffic service, the encounter could not simply be ignored. The Irish Aviation Authority confirmed it had filed a report and would examine the matter through its confidential occurrence process. As for an explanation, the meteor idea actually surfaced in the moment from one of the pilots themselves, who wondered aloud over the radio whether they were watching something re-enter the atmosphere. Afterward, An aviation journalist named Jerry Byrne told the Irish Examiner that the lights were in all probability meteorites, noting that it is not unusual for them to enter the atmosphere on a low, shallow trajectory. It is a reasonable candidate, and meteors have fooled aircrews before, but seasoned pilots described an object pacing alongside an aircraft and then turning, behavior that a falling meteor, traveling on a fixed ballistic path, does not produce. As with the others, an explanation was offered, and the people who actually saw it were left with a description it did not quite cover. What these cases share, taken one at a time, each of these encounters has a tidy, conventional explanation waiting for it. Air crews do misjudge planets at night. Storms do create optical illusions. Cold air does produce strange clouds. Meteors are mistaken for craft all the time. The individual debunking is never hard to assemble. What is harder to account for is the structure that repeats across all five, regardless of the decade or the equipment involved. First, the witnesses are not anonymous. They are pilots and crew who file legal flight records, who answer to dispatch and to controllers, who speak in standard phraseology, and who put a professional reputation at risk every time they key the radio to report something they cannot identify. These are the most trained sky watchers there are, and they are precisely the people most likely to be ridiculed for speaking up. Second, the corroboration tends to come from outside a single cockpit, a military field that saw the same object half an hour before a pair of airline pilots did. A second airliner routed to confirm a target. A controller calling air defense and getting an unsettling answer back. 3 crews on the same frequency on the same morning, each describing the same thing from a different aircraft. These are not lone observers who could be talking themselves into something. They are independent sources arriving at the same description, often without knowing the others existed. There is also the matter of the instruments. In several of these cases, the object left little or nothing on radar, and skeptics treat that as the end of the discussion. No return, no object. But radar is not a perfect eye. It is tuned to find specific kinds of targets, and it routinely misses things that are real, while the trained human beings looking out the window are doing exactly the job they were hired to do. When the screen and the crew disagree, the convenient move is to trust the screen and quietly set aside the people. In each of these cases, that is roughly what happened. Third, and most resistant to explanation, the official conclusion repeatedly arrives in a shape that does not fit the specifics the crews actually reported. A meteor that pauses and turns, a planet that paces a jet for 30 minutes, a weather event that hovers over one gate and then drills through the cloud deck on its way up. The explanation closes the file, but it does not close the gap between what was filed and what was seen. And that is the pattern that outlasts any single night. The encounter is logged, an answer is offered, the record moves on, and the testimony of the people who were there quietly drifts into a category the system was never built to hold. Which leaves the real question: if this is what the documented cases look like, the ones that made it onto a controller's tape and into an official report, how many more never got reported at all, kept quiet by crews who simply decided it was not worth the cost of saying what they saw?